Manhattan, New York. It was 2:47 p.m. on Saturday, October 10, 1964, when Mayme Johnson, 58, and her daughter Ruthie Johnson, 29, stepped through the tall glass and brass doors of Bergmann Sterling. It was the kind of boutique you'd only find on Fifth Avenue, a place that had served the city's richest families for decades. Only recently had it started allowing black customers inside, and even that had come with quiet resistance. The two women were dressed with elegance and intention. May wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, a pearl necklace and matching earrings, and carried a leather handbag that alone cost more than many Harlem families made in a whole season. Ruthie wore a soft cream dress with white gloves. Her hair was flawless. Together they looked every bit as polished as the women who usually shop there. They entered calmly, with quiet dignity, and began browsing the displays of designer dresses and imported fabrics like women who belonged there, who knew style, who knew value, and who had every right to be in that space. A sales clerk approached them, a young white woman, as several witnesses later described, and asked if she could help. May explained they were looking for evening wear for an upcoming event, and would love to see the store's best selection. The clerk looked unsure, perhaps uneasy, but tried to stay professional. She showed them a few pieces from the fall collection. For about 15 minutes, the atmosphere remained steady. May and Ruthie asked thoughtful questions, talked about fabrics and cuts, carried themselves with grace. Their voices were clear, educated, calm. Women who knew what they were doing. A few white shoppers glanced at them, some curious, others uncomfortable, but no one said anything. The Civil Rights Act had been signed just 3 months earlier, and while not everyone welcomed the change, most understood that the law had shifted. Open discrimination wasn't just unacceptable, it was now illegal. People were adjusting, some reluctantly. And then, at exactly 3:02 p.m., Charles Whitfield Pettin III walked into the store. Pettin was 64 years old at the time. A real estate tycoon, he'd inherited $12 million from his grandfather's shipping business and had turned it into $45 million through ruthless Manhattan property deals. He owned nearly 20 buildings in Midtown, ran major developments, and sat on the boards of banks and country clubs that had only recently started allowing Jewish members, but still blocked black applicants through other means. Pettin had come to pick up some suits he'd had custom made. But when he saw May and Ruthie standing near the evening wear section well-dressed, calm, being assisted by a white clerk, his reaction, according to multiple witnesses, was immediate and intense. He stormed toward them. His voice rose as he walked, getting louder with every step. Within seconds he was shouting. The words he used? No family newspaper would print them. The slurs, the insults described by those present as deeply hateful, were so harsh. Even customers with their own prejudices were stunned into silence. 7 shoppers and 3 store employees later spoke to the New York Observer. They said, Pettin hurled the worst possible language at 2 women he had never met. He claimed they had no place in that store. He called the Civil Rights Act a disgrace, accused the women of being criminals, and said they must have stolen the money they were using to shop. He questioned their appearance, their right to exist in that space, and tore into them with a rage that felt personal, even though at WSN single quotes to one customer. Margaret Holbrook, 50, was shopping for her granddaughter's baptism dress when it happened. I've lived in New York all my life, she told the Observer. When I was young, people said awful things about black folks, and it was normal back then. But after the civil rights movement, after the law passed in July, people knew. You couldn't say those things out loud anymore, not in public. But Mr. Pettin didn't care. She recalled how he screamed that the 2 women were animals, claimed they were contaminating the boutique, and said store owners should have the right to turn away whoever they pleased. He demanded they leave before he made sure they were. Forced out, through it all, May and Ruthie didn't respond. They stood quietly, didn't argue, didn't cry. They held their ground, trying to maintain some level of dignity as a man with power, wealth, and influence publicly berated them in front of strangers. And then Patton crossed another line. According to multiple witnesses, he grabbed a gown Ruthie had been admiring, a $650 evening dress, imported silk from France. He threw it to the floor and shouted that it was ruined now that she'd touched it. He offered to pay for the gown only if the store promised to destroy it instead of selling it to someone else. He demanded to see the store manager, demanded to know how people like them were even allowed inside, threatened to cut ties with the boutique unless they went back to their old ways of keeping people like the Johnsons out. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 minutes. But for everyone inside, it felt like an hour. Robert Chun, a 42-year-old store employee, later said, "Mr. Patton was out of control. Screaming, angry, loud. And those two women, they just stood there, taking it, silent, strong. I'll never forget it." The older woman looked like she wanted to say something, like she had the words ready, but was holding herself back on purpose. She seemed to know that saying anything would only make the situation worse. The younger woman, Ruthie, couldn't hold back. She was crying, not loud or dramatic, just silent tears, steady, while the man in front of her kept going. Other shoppers had stopped and were watching. Most of them looked uncomfortable, but nobody stepped in. Nobody told the man to stop. Nobody said a word in defense of the two women. We all just stood there, frozen, while this wealthy white man stripped two women of their dignity in the middle of an upscale boutique. Finally, after what witnesses later estimated to be about 5 to 7 minutes of relentless verbal abuse, Mayme Johnson gently took her daughter's hand. Without saying a word, she turned toward the door, head held high. They didn't rush. They didn't argue. They walked with quiet pride. Even as the tears streamed down both of their faces, Patton wasn't done. He followed them all the way to the entrance, still shouting insults and racial slurs as they stepped onto the sidewalk. And then, standing in the doorway, he yelled one final thing. Margaret Holbrook, one of the witnesses, remembered it clearly. The Civil Rights Act doesn't change reality. This isn't your neighborhood, and stores like this aren't for people like you. He stood there, yelling down the street after them as they walked away. It was one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen, Holbrook told the Observer. Especially in 1964, I thought we were past this kind of hatred. But what Charles Patton didn't realize in that moment, what nobody in Bergmann and Sterling knew yet, was that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Those two women weren't just anyone. They weren't random shoppers. They were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man who, just 11 months earlier, had walked out of federal prison, and since then had been quietly rebuilding the network, the organization, and the influence that once made him one of the most powerful figures on either side of the law in all of New York. And now, Bumpy Johnson was about to teach Charles Whitfield Patton III a lesson in consequences. Later that same day, Saturday evening, October 10th, 1964, May and Ruthie Johnson arrived at Bumpy's office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street. It was around 4:30 p.m., about an hour and a half after they had left the boutique. Both were still shaken. William "Bub" Hewlett, Bumpy's longtime bodyguard, was there when they arrived. According to him, May had tried to keep things calm. She didn't want to bring trouble to her husband, especially not this soon after his release. She came in like everything was fine, Hewlett recalled. But Ruthie was still crying, and Bumpy saw it right away. He asked what had happened. May tried to brush it off. "Just an ugly moment," she said. "The kind of thing black women still deal with in stores even now. even after the law had changed, but Bumpy kept pressing. And finally, Ruthie told him everything. Told him about the man who'd screamed at them, about the slurs, about the dress he'd thrown on the ground, about how nobody had helped. Just stood there and watched. Hewlett said Bumpy didn't react at first. He listened quietly, no expression except for a slight tightening around his eyes. People who knew him recognized that look. It wasn't rage, at least not the kind you show. It was calculation. Focused out. When Ruthie finished, Bumpy asked just one thing. Did anyone get the man's name? May said no. It had all happened so fast. They just wanted to get out of there. But she remembered that someone had called him Mr. Pettin. She also recalled him mentioning his buildings and picking up suits. It was clear he was a wealthy regular. Bumpy nodded. And then, according to Hewlett, said calmly, "Go home. Rest. Take care of Ruthie. I'll handle it." The way he said it, Hewlett added, I knew someone was going to pay, and pay bad. That was Bumpy. With his family, he was warm, affectionate, steady. But when someone crossed the line, especially with people he loved, he turned into something else entirely. Cold, controlled, dangerous. After May and Ruthie left, Bumpy made calls. First to his attorney, Theodore Green. Then to various associates, some from his old crew, some from his legitimate business circle. Then to contacts who knew the ins and outs of Manhattan real estate. By 6 p.m., he had a name, Charles Whitfield Pettin III, and not just a name. He had a file. A real estate empire worth $45 million. Properties all over Midtown. Ties to banks, to country clubs, to politicians. A reputation for being quietly racist and for never renting to anyone he deemed undesirable. But what mattered more was how he operated. Bumpy learned Pettin was leveraged. He had debts. He had deals waiting for funding. He needed banks to keep him afloat. And banks, in 1964, were starting to care about public image. Bumpy made about 20 calls that night, Green said later. He was collecting information, names, business partners. Pending deals. It was a strategy. Precise, surgical. By Sunday morning, Bumpy had a full plan, not just revenge. Something bigger, something calculated. A way to dismantle Pettin's world without ever laying a hand on him. He would ruin him the same way. Pettin had tried to ruin May and Ruthie publicly, systematically. Over the next 72 hours, Bumpy put the plan in motion. He reached out to political contacts, explaining what had happened. He asked for help, not violence, not chaos, but discretion. Coordination. Pressure applied where it would hurt the most. Pettin's reputation, his deals, his connections. That was Bumpy's genius. He didn't just hurt people. He understood how to make others do it for him. Quietly, cleanly. Pettin humiliated his wife and daughter in front of a room full of people, Green said. So Bumpy set out to make sure that every other racist businessman in Manhattan learned one thing. You might have power, but that doesn't mean you're untouchable. And just like that, the rules of engagement had changed, because in post-civil Rights Act America, attacking black families wasn't just morally wrong. It was becoming bad business, especially when those families were connected to someone like Bumpy Johnson. According to several sources, Johnson spent around $75,000 over the next 72 hours. Not on bribes, not on anything illegal. Every dollar went toward legitimate business transactions and carefully planned actions. All of it completely legal, but executed with surgical precision. And every move made to quietly damage Charles Pettin's world. It started with the banks. Johnson had strong relationships with 3 institutions that operated in Harlem banks, that also happened to hold large loans connected to Pettin's real estate developments. Through trusted intermediaries, Bumpy arranged for these banks to receive detailed reports, financial documents that were factual, but put together in a very specific way. They didn't lie, explained Theodore Green, Johnson's lawyer. They didn't need to. The numbers were real. The reports simply highlighted the risk. The documents laid it out clearly. Pettin's business was heavily leveraged. He was carrying a lot of debt, relying on bank funding to stay afloat. Some of his projects were over budget. Others were behind schedule. Most importantly, the reports noted his public outburst on October 10th and how that incident could violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the Civil Rights Act. If that got public attention, it could expose the banks to reputational damage or worse. Loan officers received the reports on Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, October 12th, all three banks had initiated internal reviews of Pettin's accounts, not because anyone forced them to, but because the information had raised flags. Pettin suddenly looked like a financial risk, and the public relations one. And that was just the beginning. Bumpy's next move involved civil rights groups. Even with his background, Johnson had long supported organizations like CORE and the NAACP. Some of it was personal belief. Some of it was strategic. Supporting civil rights causes gave him political cover and community goodwill. Either way, he had relationships. And now he used them. He reached out to contacts in the movement, not with demands, not with threats, just with facts. He told us what happened, said Reverend James Mitchell, a Harlem minister who worked closely with local organizers. He laid it out clearly, what Pettin said, what he did, how he treated two black women in public. Johnson also shared details of Pettin's long history of discrimination, refusing to rent to black families, blocking them from his buildings, quietly but deliberately excluding them from Manhattan housing. And then he offered financial support, not for control, not for attention, just to help. At first, some civil rights leaders were hesitant. Johnson's name carried baggage, but he made it clear he wasn't asking for anything in return, just that something be done. The groups accepted the help, and they got to work. Meanwhile, Johnson turned to Pettin's business partners. Pettin wasn't a solo operator. He had investors, wealthy men with skin in the game, people who expected returns and didn't want their reputations damaged by association. Through quiet channels, Bumpy had those partners contacted. They were shown the same reports, given the same facts, told about the civil rights protests that were now being planned. The tone wasn't threatening, it was informative. But the message was clear. If they stayed connected to Pettin, their names could end up in the spotlight too. The information hit its mark. By Sunday night, those partners were calling Pettin, asking questions, pushing for answers, wondering how he planned to deal with what was coming. He spent the next day trying to calm them down, reassuring them, managing their fear. But while he was distracted trying to keep his partners from walking away, the real fallout was just beginning. Because Bumpy had one more card to play: the media. He had relationships with black newspapers across New York and with white reporters who covered Harlem and civil rights issues. Through those contacts, Johnson made sure the Bergmann and Sterling story reached the press. On Sunday, October 11th, the New York Amsterdam News ran a front-page piece. Manhattan developer screams racist abuse at black shoppers, throws clothing on floor. The article didn't name May or Ruthie, but the details were unmistakable to anyone who had witnessed the incident. By Monday, the story had spread. The New York Times ran a shorter piece on page 12 titled "Allegations of Discrimination at Fifth Avenue Boutique Following Confrontation." The tone was reserved, but the message was clear. Things had happened that didn't line up with the new legal and social landscape of 1964. And then, Monday morning came the protest. At 9 a.m. on October 12th, around 50 protesters from CORE and the NAACP gathered in front of Pettin's largest residential building on West 86th Street. They held signs. They passed out flyers. The signs read, "Pettin discriminates against black tenants. Racist landlord violates Civil Rights Act. Justice for all. No exceptions." The flyers detailed the October 10th incident at Bergmann Sterling. They also outlined Pettin's long-standing refusal to rent to black families, backed up with names, dates, and public records. And this time, people were paying attention. Tenants saw the signs. Local media showed up. People walking by stopped to read the flyers. And inside the building, Pettin's staff were overwhelmed. Calls came in from residents asking questions. Reporters asked for statements. And Pettin, still busy trying to reassure partners and manage the banks, was running out of answers. This was no longer just about one ugly scene at a store. This was now about business, about perception, about risk. And the man who just 48 hours earlier had stood in a boutique shouting that stores like this aren't for people like you was suddenly facing a very different kind of reality. One where words had consequences, where racism wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was bad business. And where a single moment of public cruelty, aimed at the wrong family, could unravel everything you'd built, quietly, legally, completely. Similar protests unfolded at two more of Pettin's buildings that Monday. Each demonstration was peaceful, well-organized, and clearly legal, but the impact was unmistakable. Reporters showed up. Photos were taken. And a sense of public controversy began forming around Pettin's name. The protests didn't block doors or threaten anyone, said Reverend Mitchell. They just stood on the sidewalks with signs and handed out flyers. But the message landed. Suddenly, Pettin's buildings weren't just places to live, they were tied to headlines about racism and civil rights. That made tenants uneasy, and it made Pettin's business partners even more nervous. No one wanted to be associated with someone becoming a public target for civil rights groups. That evening, the effort expanded. Johnson funded community organizers to work with residents living inside Pettin's buildings. Many had been dealing with poor maintenance, rising rents, and quiet but persistent discrimination for years. They hadn't fought back before because they felt isolated. Alone, they didn't have much power, but together, everything changed. On the evening of October 12th, around 200 tenants from 9 of Pettin's properties gathered in a Harlem church. With guidance from the organizers Johnson had supported, they formed a tenant association. That night they announced a coordinated plan: rent strikes, formal complaints to housing authorities, and legal action unless conditions improved and unless the discrimination stopped. Bumpy gave money for the flyers. The lawyers, the church space, Reverend Mitchell explained, but he didn't want credit. He wasn't doing it to be seen. He wanted Pettin to finally face consequences, not just for how he treated Bumpy's family, but for the years of quiet discrimination against people who hadn't had the resources to push back. Meanwhile, Johnson turned his attention to Pettin's social life. Pettin was a member of 2 of Manhattan's most exclusive country clubs. These clubs had long histories of exclusion, especially toward black and Jewish members, but had recently started admitting a handful of Jewish individuals under pressure. After the Civil Rights Act passed in July, through intermediaries, Johnson arranged for both clubs to receive detailed reports. The documentation included Pettin's actions at Bergmann and Sterling, the protests, the tenant movement, and the growing media attention. The clubs were in a tough spot, said Green. They were trying to appear compliant with the law while holding on to their traditions. But Pettin had become a risk. What Pettin had done, shouting racist insults at two black women in public was exactly the kind of thing that drew the wrong kind of attention. Quiet pressure was applied, and by Monday evening, one club asked him to step down to avoid controversy. Second club didn't act immediately, but placed his membership on hold pending a full review. By Tuesday morning, October 13th, the pressure had compounded into a full-blown crisis. Everything was unraveling at once. At the banks, decisions had been made. Two of the three financial institutions that reviewed Pettin's accounts opted to call in their loans, demanding immediate repayment of a combined $9 million. The clauses in Pettin's loan agreements allowed for this if lenders determined his financial standing had changed or if his actions posed reputational risks to the bank. Bumpy didn't fabricate anything, Green said. He just presented the truth in a way that made the risk impossible to ignore. Pettin didn't have that kind of money sitting in liquid assets. To cover the loan calls, he'd either need to sell properties fast at reduced value or secure new financing, which wasn't going to be easy with his name suddenly linked to civil rights violations. And it didn't stop there. That same day, 4 of his business partners publicly withdrew from joint real estate projects. Their reasons were stated clearly: concern over Pettin's handling of civil rights matters, and the growing negative media spotlight. The withdrawals forced Pettin to either buy them out at a steep cost or scramble to find replacement partners willing to invest in projects surrounded by controversy. Later that Tuesday evening, the tenant group made its first major move. They announced an official rent strike across 4 of Pettin's buildings. Around 150 families began placing their rent into escrow accounts instead of sending it to Pettin's company. Their message was clear. They wouldn't pay directly until building conditions improved and discriminatory policies ended. The strike immediately disrupted about $60,000 in monthly revenue. It also brought legal complications. Pettin couldn't simply evict strikers anymore. They had legal representation now, and the media was watching. He had to hire lawyers, prepare for drawn-out legal fights, and try to contain a situation that had grown beyond his control. And then came the social fallout. By Tuesday night, families who had once dined with Pettin attended his parties and invited him to events were no longer taking his calls. Dinners were canceled. Invitations were quietly withdrawn. His name was being whispered in conversations, always with the same message. Pettin had gone too far. Margaret Holbrook, a witness to the Bergmann and Sterling incident and a longtime member of Pettin's social circle, described the shift. Everyone heard what happened, she said. Some people were genuinely upset by the racism. Others didn't care about the racism itself. They just didn't like that it had become public, loud, crude. In 1954, you could get away with something like that. But this is 1964. The law is changing. The culture is changing. You simply can't act like that anymore without consequences. By the end of the day, Charles Pettin was effectively being pushed out of his own world. People who'd known him for decades were suddenly unavailable. His status was crumbling, not just in business, but in the social circles that once gave him power. Wednesday, October 14, 1964. Pettin arrived at his office early, exhausted, trying to figure out what had happened and who was behind it. Who did this to me? He reportedly asked out loud. By then, it was obvious. His empire was teetering. The banks were calling in millions. His partners were leaving. Tenants were refusing to pay. Civil rights groups were outside his buildings every day. Newspapers were publishing story after story about his discriminatory practices. His name had become radioactive. One country club had expelled him. The other had suspended him. And behind it all, quietly watching, never appearing publicly, never issuing a threat, was a man named Bumpy Johnson. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't broken a law. He'd simply pulled the right strings, made the right calls, and reminded everyone in Manhattan that respect isn't just about power. It's about how you use it. By Wednesday morning, Charles Pettin's world had unraveled, and he still couldn't figure out how or why it had all collapsed. So quickly, according to sources close to him, Pettin spent the morning making frantic calls. He was trying to understand why the banks had suddenly called in their loans, why his partners were backing away, why civil rights organizations had singled him out, especially when so many Manhattan landlords had quietly practiced the same kind of discrimination for years. Some of the people he called mentioned the incident at Bergmann and Sterling. They brought up the protests that began on Monday, the media stories, and the growing concern that being linked to Pettin now came with a price, that anyone connected to him might get caught in the backlash, but no one mentioned Bumpy Johnson, and that was by design. Johnson had kept his involvement completely hidden. Every move against Pettin had been technically legal. Every step had been carried out by intermediaries with no direct ties back to Johnson. As far as Pettin could tell, this crisis had just happened. He had no idea that the collapse of his reputation and business had been orchestrated deliberately, precisely by the husband of the two women he had publicly humiliated just 4 days earlier. That changed Wednesday afternoon. At around 2:30 p.m. on October 14th, Pettin received a visitor at his Midtown Manhattan office. A man named Theodore Green. Green introduced himself as an attorney representing certain Harlem business interests. I walked into his office, and he looked awful. Green later told the Observer. He hadn't shaved. He looked like he'd been wearing the same suit for 2 days. Papers were everywhere. He was on the phone trying to find emergency financing to cover the loan calls. When Green entered, Pettin barely glanced up. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested," he said. "I'm dealing with multiple crises." "I know," Green replied. "I'm here to explain why you're dealing with multiple crises at the same time." Green took a seat and calmly laid it out. He told Pettin that what he was experiencing wasn't some random coincidence. It wasn't bad luck. It was retaliation. It was intentional. And it was deserved. 4 days ago, Green said, you screamed racial insults at 2 black women inside a boutique on Fifth Avenue. You humiliated them. You threw a dress on the floor. You ranted about the Civil Rights Act being communist. You told them to leave. Green paused. Those 2 women, he continued, were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Johnson, a man with deep ties to Harlem's business world and strong connections across New York's political, civil rights, and media communities. Mr. Johnson didn't take kindly to the way you treated his family. Green went on to explain what Pettin hadn't yet put together: the bank loan reviews, the partner withdrawals, the protests, the tenant organizing, the media coverage, the cold shoulder from his social circle. All of it, Green said, was Mr. Johnson sending you a message. The message was simple. The Civil Rights Act isn't just words on paper. When you treat black people with open contempt, especially in this new era, there are consequences. Green remembered the moment Pettin realized the truth. His face went pale. He said. He muttered, "That's not possible. Bumpy Johnson is a criminal. He just got out of prison last year. He doesn't have power like that, not with banks, not with country clubs, not with business leaders." Green shook his head. "You clearly don't understand who Mr. Johnson is," he replied. "You think his influence ends at the street level, but he has connections everywhere in every part of this city. Black, white, Chinese, Italian, Jewish, Puerto Rican. He funds civil rights groups. He knows media people, politicians, business executives. And when someone harms his family, he uses every connection he has to make sure that person regrets it." Then Green said something else. Welcome to October 1964. Mr. Pettin, the Civil Rights Act isn't just legislation, it's becoming real. And men like Mr. Johnson are making sure that people like you feel the cost of racism in ways that matter most. To you, reputation, business, status. Pettin was stunned. He asked if there was anything he could do. Anything that would make Johnson stop what he was doing. An apology. A donation. Anything. Green's answer was simple. No, he said. The damage is done. Your loans are already called. Your partners are gone. Your tenants are organized. Civil rights groups are protesting your buildings. Your social standing is over. Mr. Johnson doesn't want your apology. He doesn't want your money. He wanted you to understand what happens when you treat black women the way you did. Green stood up. But before leaving, he delivered one final message. Oh, and one more thing, he said. Mr. Johnson wants you to know that his wife and daughter will be returning to Bergmann Sterling next Saturday, October 17th, same time. Green looked Pettin in the eyes. They're going to shop there again. And if anyone's store management, customers, or you treats them with anything less than full and complete respect, what you've experienced this week will feel like a mild warning compared to what happens next. Pettin didn't respond. He just sat there, quiet, shaken, overwhelmed. On Saturday, October 17, 1964, exactly 1 week after the incident, May and Ruthie Johnson returned to Bergmann Sterling at 2:45 p.m. They were dressed with the same elegance and quiet pride as before. Outside the store, Theodore Green and William Bub Hewlett stood near the entrance. They didn't follow the women inside. They didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, and this time, every employee, every customer, and every onlooker inside Bergmann Sterling knew exactly who the Johnson women were, and exactly what would happen if they weren't. Treated with the respect they'd always deserved. Outside the boutique that afternoon, around 30 members of CORE and the NAACP stood quietly nearby. They hadn't come to protest, they came to witness. Their presence was peaceful but purposeful, to ensure that May and Ruthie Johnson could return to Bergmann Sterling without fear of harassment. According to several people who were there, the return visit was nothing like the first. This time, the store manager met the women at the door personally. He greeted them by name and apologized profusely for what had happened the week before. He explained that Charles Pettin was no longer welcome in the store, that he had been permanently banned. He assured them that Bergmann Sterling was now fully committed to serving all customers respectfully, in full compliance with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 3 sales clerks were assigned to assist May and Ruthie throughout their 90-minute visit. They showed them the finest pieces, answered every question, and treated them with a kind of careful, polished courtesy usually reserved for the store's wealthiest clients regardless of race. Other shoppers noticed the change too. Several customers who had been present on October 10th, the day of Pettin's outburst, made a point to engage with the Johnsons. They offered compliments, polite small talk, kind words about their style and grace. Their behavior made something very clear. Black customers were welcome here now, and what had happened last week wouldn't be repeated. The difference was remarkable, said Margaret Holbrook, who happened to be shopping again that Saturday. Last week, we stood there in silence while those 2 women were humiliated. This week, they were treated like royalty. Holbrook said the store staff were apologetic, the clerks attentive, and the atmosphere completely transformed. Those of us who'd stayed silent before, we tried to make up for it, even in small ways. I introduced myself to the older woman, Mrs. Johnson. I learned and apologized for not standing up for them when it happened. Mrs. Johnson, she said, was gracious. She accepted the apology, saying she hoped what had happened would lead to real change, not just for her and Ruthie, but for all black shoppers who had been mistreated or ignored in stores like this for too long. May and Ruthie left the boutique with about $1,500 worth of clothing and accessories. They'd come for evening wear, but picked up a few other items as well. The store manager personally wrapped their purchases and walked them to the door, apologizing once more and inviting them to return any time. Outside, the Corps and NAACP members applauded as the women exited, shopping bags in hand, a small but powerful gesture. It wasn't just about a dress. It was about what it meant, that black women could now shop on Fifth Avenue without fear. That community pressure could help turn the Civil Rights Act from policy into practice. As May and Ruthie stepped onto the sidewalk, Hewlett and Green fell in beside them for the short walk back to the waiting car. "How was your shopping experience, Mrs. Johnson?" Green asked, a small smile playing on his face. "Much improved from last Saturday." "Thank you. You Theodore?" She replied, according to Hewlett's later account, "Please tell Bumpy his intervention was appreciated and extremely effective. Though I suspect the entire city already knows what happens when someone insults his family." "I'll pass along the message," Green said. "Though I'm sure he already knows. And I'd bet every other racist businessman in Manhattan knows now, too." Charles Whitfield Pettin III never recovered. The 72-hour unraveling of his empire was complete and permanent. By December 1964, he'd been forced to sell 14 of his 19 buildings, most at steep losses, to raise enough cash to cover loan calls and buy out his former partners. His net worth, once an estimated $45 million, had shrunk to about $11 million by February 1965, a chunk to about $11 million by an infant $11 million by February 1965. A femfen $2,000 and semfen to about $11 million, $34 million drop in just 4 months. The social fallout didn't stop either. He was permanently expelled from both of his country clubs. He was no longer invited to the events, dinners, or charity galas he'd once helped host. And in January 1965, his wife filed for separation. She moved to their Connecticut estate and refused to return, telling friends she could no longer show her face in Manhattan society, not after her husband had become a public symbol of racism in the new civil rights era. Pettin tried to rebuild his reputation in 1965 and 1966, but the damage was already done. Banks wouldn't lend to him. Investors wouldn't partner with him. Tenants avoided his properties when they had other options. His name had become toxic. And in April 1968, at age 68, Pettin died of a heart attack. He died forgotten by the same elite circles that once embraced him. "What Bumpy did to Pettin became legendary," said Reverend Mitchell. In the criminal world, it showed that Bumpy's reach extended far beyond Harlem, that no amount of wealth or social status could protect someone who disrespected him or his family. But in the civil rights community, the message was different and just as powerful. Activists saw it as proof that the Civil Rights Act could be enforced, Mitchell continued, not just by the courts, but by people through coordinated economic pressure and organized community action. That racist business practices could be punished. That people who thought they could keep doing things the old way could be held accountable publicly and financially when they stepped out of line. Pettin learned that lesson too late. He learned that October 1964 wasn't October 1954, that the Civil Rights Act had real weight when people like Bumpy Johnson chose to use it, that treating black people with open contempt could cost you everything. Fall of Charles Pettin sent a ripple through Manhattan's elite, the organizing Johnson had supported. The media coverage he had triggered and the clear example he had made caused quiet panic among some and genuine change among others. Several exclusive retailers who had resisted integrating who had unofficially discouraged black customers even if they no longer outright refused service, began to shift. Slowly at first, but visibly. By the end of 1964 and into 1965, more Fifth Avenue stores began training staff to serve all customers with equal respect. Some even launched ads in black newspapers to make their new policies clear. Bergmann Sterling hired its first black sales clerk in November 1964. They became a symbol of how fast things could change when legal mandates met public pressure and economic consequences. Other stores followed, some out of fear, others out of a growing understanding that exclusion was no longer acceptable or profitable. Bumpy didn't set out to integrate Manhattan retail, Green said, but that's exactly what he did. Bumpy Johnson never set out to change a city. He set out to respond to a personal insult, one aimed at the two people he loved most. But by destroying Charles Pettin so thoroughly and doing it so publicly, Bumpy ended up doing more than just defending his family. He made an example. By showing that racism could have real, devastating economic consequences in the post-Civil Rights Act era, Bumpy unintentionally accelerated integration across Manhattan's retail and real estate industries. Stores and landlords began to change, not just because the law required it, but because Pettin's downfall showed what could happen when powerful men used discrimination as policy in a world that was finally starting to push back. In late 1964 and into 1965, integration moved faster than expected in certain parts of Manhattan, not just because civil rights groups were demanding it, but because Pettin's collapse had become a quiet warning among the city's business elite: don't discriminate in public. Don't mistreat black customers, because you never know who they're connected to or what consequences might follow. Within those circles, the story of what happened to Charles Pettin spread quickly. And while Bumpy Johnson never admitted to having any role in it, no one close to the situation had any doubts. When The Observer reached out to Johnson for comment in mid-October 1964, he declined. Instead, his attorney Theodore Green issued a brief written statement. Mr. Johnson has no knowledge of Mr. Pettin's financial difficulties or social problems. Mr. Johnson is a Harlem businessman who focuses on his own affairs and has no involvement in Manhattan real estate or in the personal conflicts of individuals he's never met. If Mr. Pettin is experiencing hardship, Mr. Johnson suggests he consult with his bankers and business advisors rather than seeking external scapegoats. Mr. Johnson supports the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and believes all Americans should be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of race. Any businessman who violates the Civil Rights Act should expect to face appropriate legal and economic consequences. That was the only public comment Johnson ever made on the matter. But within his circle, among his friends, associates, and family, there was no ambiguity. Bumpy never talked about it, said William Howlett, his longtime associate. He didn't brag, didn't seek credit, didn't want publicity. That would have drawn attention he didn't need. But everyone close to him understood exactly what happened. Pettin had insulted Bumpy's wife and daughter on October 10th, and within 72 hours, everything Pettin had built began to collapse. To anyone paying attention, the connection was obvious. And so was the message: if you disrespect Bumpy Johnson's family, you better be ready to lose everything. In the fall of 1964, the Civil Rights Act was still new. Enforcement was slow. Many believed the law didn't yet carry real weight. But Bumpy proved otherwise. He showed that even if the legal system wasn't ready to defend black dignity, the community could and would step in with its own form of enforcement. The story of what followed after October 10th spread quickly across Harlem, through the civil rights movement, even through New York's underworld. It became a kind of blueprint, A wealthy, well-connected white man had humiliated two black women in a Fifth Avenue store, unaware that they had powerful backing. And within 1 week, that man lost $34 million, his reputation, his business partners, and his place in high society. And those same two women walked back into that store the following Saturday, not as victims, but as respected customers. They were served with courtesy. The manager personally apologized. White customers who had once watched in silence now offered smiles and kind words. The change was visible and undeniable. That was the lesson Charles Pettin learned too late. That October 1964 wasn't October 1954. That things had changed. That the Civil Rights Act, still fresh ink on paper, had real-world consequences when someone with the resources and resolve chose to enforce it. That Bumpy Johnson, yes, a man with a criminal past, a man who had walked out of federal prison less than a year earlier, more real influence than most people in Manhattan's elite could begin to understand. Pettin had thought he could shout someone down and walk away untouched. Instead, it cost him everything. But this story wasn't just about revenge. What Bumpy did sent ripples far beyond Charles Pettin's personal loss. In the weeks and months that followed, the impact continued to unfold. Store managers who had once quietly turned away black customers began to reconsider their approach. Real estate developers who had ignored the law started thinking twice, not necessarily out of moral awakening, but out of economic self-preservation. The Civil Rights Act might have been the law, but now it had teeth, all because one man understood how to wield power. Bumpy didn't set out to integrate Manhattan stores, said Theodore Green, but that's what he ended up doing. He showed that civil rights could be enforced not just through courts, but through strategy, through pressure, through targeted action that left no fingerprints but left lasting change. The fear that someone like Bumpy might be watching was enough to shift policies, to open doors that had been closed, to challenge practices that had once seemed permanent. And suddenly, wealthy black shoppers who had long been treated as invisible were walking into high-end stores and being treated like they mattered. Pettin had thought power meant being able to say what you wanted to whomever you wanted, without consequence. Bumpy understood something else, that real power isn't measured by who you can hurt without backlash. It's measured by your ability to protect what matters to you, and by your ability to make people who cross the line pay a price they can't afford. In October 1964, Bumpy Johnson proved that. And in doing so, he didn't just protect his family. He helped change the rules.